The pressure of men's hands has been upon us far too heavily. Our brethren have pressed upon every inch of our privileges and our sacred rights. The year is 1845, and America is expanding and changing as a nation. Florida has just been added as the 27th state, and the Republic of Texas has been eyeing annexation as the 28th. America is pushing ever west, and for the first time in history, the words manifest destiny are used to describe the political hopes of the American people to pursue an empire spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Another type of change is also gripping America. Since 1789, American states had begun declaring slavery illegal. By 1845, all of the new southern states, including Florida and Texas, depended heavily on slavery for their economy. This division would eventually lead to the Civil War a mere 2 decades later, but for now, it was left to the convictions of American citizens. The churches were no different. The Presbyterians were already beginning to split along geographical and theological lines in 1837, and in 1844, the Methodists split for a second time in 2 years when a slave-owning bishop was asked to resign. In 1845, the Baptists would see their own crisis of faith as the fight for missionary appointments surrounding missionary appointments in the Baptist Convention at the time. The controversy was that the Triennial Convention would not allow any slaveholder to inhabit a post either in the Foreign Mission Board or in the Domestic Mission Board. If you owned slaves, you could not go and preach the gospel as a missionary of the Baptist Convention. It was simple as that. Now, biblically, that seems really, really consistent. That seems good. It doesn't make sense to me logically that someone who owns slaves, who owns human beings, should then go and preach the gospel of freedom and the gospel of peace. Baptists in the South threatened to withhold funds from the Baptist agencies if the anti-slavery agenda was passed. The issue came to a head in 1845 when the Home Missions Board refused to appoint a Georgia slaveholder as one of their new missionaries. Over the course of a few days in May, churches and agencies loyal to the cause of slavery gathered in Augusta, Georgia. 293 Baptist leaders of the South gathered at the First Baptist Church to hammer out the identity and constitution of a brand new pro-slavery body. William B. Johnson, the convention's first president, spoke before the gathered messengers and explained that the split was painful, but necessary to counter what was labeled as a fanatical attempt to exclude us of the South from Christian fellowship. When the Southern Baptist leadership met in 1845, their chief concern, according to the meeting notes, was that they were not being allowed to preach the gospel. That's what W.B. Johnson meant when he said that we were being denied our sacred rights. He was saying that they were not allowed to preach the gospel. They were not allowed to obey Jesus when he commanded them to fulfill the Great Commission. How genuine was that complaint? Did W.B. Johnson and the other Southern Baptists have a good reason to split? Were they right in saying that their rights to preach the gospel had been violated? Or were they just trying to keep their slaves? Noted scholar Timothy George notes that it is important to recognize that Johnson and his peers at the time represented the best, not the worst, of Southern culture and religion. George believes that their motivations for missions and evangelism was genuine, even if it meant that their conscience had been corroded by racism. On the other hand, racism isn't anything new. Human beings have struggled with acknowledging the dignity of everyone since Cain and Abel, and the consistent message of the Bible is that God created all men and women in His image. Why then should Johnson and the other Southern Baptist founders get a pass? Shouldn't men of the Bible, like Johnson, have been able to recognize their inconsistencies as others had done? Russell D. Moore argues that after the 1845 split, the convention became the proponents of state-sponsored terrorism, of the regimes of human slavery or the Jim Crow order. Yet even so, W.B. Johnson and the others felt that they were standing on the Bible, hoping that their legacy would secure a strong future. For Johnson, condemning slavery was paramount to interfering with what belonged to the state, i.e. to Caesar. Giving to Caesar what belongs to Caesar means that slavery should not be touched or slaves removed from their current state. In the Old Testament, you really do see two types of slavery. The first was the institution that Israel had, and the second is the institution that Israel experienced as a people. The first, the slavery that was instituted through Leviticus through Numbers, through Deuteronomy. The type of slavery you see in 1st and 2nd Samuel and the historical books where there were slaves in ancient Israel. That slavery, however, is nothing like what was had in 19th century America. The type of slavery we see in 19th century America is much more akin to the slavery that which Israel experienced. When God sent Joseph and his brothers into Egypt, as generations progressed, the pharaohs forgot about Joseph and they enslaved his entire people. This is an entire ethnic people being enslaved to build up an economy, to build up a civilization out of the desert. Now, substitute the desert for the backwoods, substitute the desert in Egypt for antebellum South, and you have something very, very similar. You have an entire people subjugated against their will, families separated, tribes broken, to build up a civilization for another people. So the type of slavery the Southern Baptists were defending was the type of slavery endorsed by Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. Southern Baptists did not come to this stance on their own. Scholars Shute, Finn, and Haken point out in the Baptist story that racism and slavery were a part of Baptist life since its foundation. Early British conventions highlighted racial stereotypes that carried over to Baptist churches in the New World. According to their research, the position held by earlier Baptists was that Africans were not fully human, yet above animals, occupying a middle position. This, of course, is radically unbiblical and denies what God has said about all men in His Word. David S. Dockery writes that the 1845 split did not happen in a vacuum, meaning that there is a context to the controversy that created the convention. Leon Macbeth has called the schism one of the most crucial events in American Baptist history. After the divide, both halves of the splintered whole developed unique characteristics and ideas throughout history. The Southern Baptists have grown to over 15 million members in the United States, making it the second largest denomination in the country. In recent years, Southern Baptists have begun to look back at their history and have begun reacting against the Founding Fathers' claims. For example, Baptist historians in the second half of the 20th century actually began to identify slavery as a key factor in the division of the Northern and Southern Baptist. Before then, Baptist historians would largely ignore slavery as an issue and focus mainly upon evangelism. It has only been in recent years that complete condemnation has been the norm among the majority of professing Baptists. In 1995, a first good step was taken. The Southern Baptist Convention condemned racism. They apologized for the racism inherent in our history, and they also apologized for our very foundation, the reason we were founded, the defense of slavery. They recognized it as sin, and they promised to do better. Around 150 miles from where the Southern Baptists first split, the convention met again to formally denounce racism and issue an official apology for the historic acts of evil, such as slavery, from which we continue to reap a bitter harvest. The resolution passed by an overwhelming 99%, signaling a sharp change in denominational practices and composition. It's a trend that's progressing to this very day, culminating in the 2003 election of Fred Luter to the presidency, marking him as the first African-American Southern Baptist president in the convention's history. They apologized to all African-American brothers for the systems and for the organizations that were racist, that were exclusive, that were not beneficial, and certainly not biblical. That's a great step forward, and since then, Southern Baptist, even amidst other controversies, has moved forward. In 2017, for example, just last year, the convention denounced the alt-right movement, and they denounced white supremacy as sin. And in 2018, a church, an all-white church who had a very racist relationship with a black congregation, was dismissed from the entire convention. Raleigh White Baptist Church came to an agreement with an all-black church to share their facilities. The all-white church had a marginal attendance at best, and when the congregations began to cross paths per their agreement, aggressions ensued. According to reports, black churchgoers were treated with disrespect, were mocked, and were forbidden from entering the church at specific times because of their race. The local association began an investigation into the matter and found evidence to remove the entire church from their fellowship. The National Convention followed suit when they met later that summer in 2018. This piece of news is singular evidence that the Southern Baptists have finally gotten their rights aligned to Scripture when it comes to race. A local association took action on their own accord, only to be affirmed at the national level by thousands of delegates representing a multitude of churches. This change is welcome, and it is most certainly a far cry from the days of defending slavery via the crook of saving souls.